Another deal had closed above the city. Another column of numbers had risen on a screen somewhere behind smoked glass and polished steel, and by the time the news reached the private club where Leo Santos worked nights, the men who repeated it were already bored of being impressed. Billionaires were discussed the way weather was discussed in neighborhoods that could afford to ignore the rain. Leo heard the name Ashford 3 times before midnight and pretended not to notice any of it. He was carrying a tray heavy with crystal tumblers, his feet hurt in both shoes, and all he could think about was whether Maya had remembered to eat before taking her medication. The club sold the illusion of quiet power. Everything in it was designed to lower voices. The walls wore dark wood and velvet the color of old wine. The lamps were deliberately dim, the kind that turned every glass into amber and every face into a secret. Men came there to make promises they would never put in writing. Women came there in silk and laughter. Leo moved through them all with the unshowy grace of someone who had learned that invisibility could be safer than charm. He kept his shirt immaculate, his answers short, and his eyes lowered just enough to avoid invitation. He had not always been good at disappearing. At 19, after their mother died and the apartment suddenly became too silent, he had learned. Rent demanded one version of him. Hospital waiting rooms demanded another. Maya, with her sharp tongue and stubborn smile and frighteningly thin wrists, needed the version that never looked tired even when he felt hollowed out to the bone. By 23, he could fold himself into whatever shape survival required. Bartender, delivery rider, breakfast shift at a cafe that smelled permanently of burnt sugar. Big brother, future father to problems that were never supposed to belong to him. That night, Boss Jean stopped him with 2 fingers against his elbow and nodded toward the elevated booth, wrapped in privacy glass. The gesture alone told Leo the guest mattered. Jean only straightened his spine like that around power or danger, and sometimes it was difficult to tell which was which. VIP suite, Jean murmured, though Leo already knew. Personally. Leo balanced the tray against his palm and looked once toward the booth. A man sat alone behind the glass, one hand loose around a crystal tumbler, the other braced against his temple as if holding back a headache or a memory. He was broad-shouldered without looking bulky, expensive in the understated way that only the truly rich could manage. His dark suit fit him too well to advertise its price. His expression was distant, but not cold. Tired, Leo thought, with a strange flicker of recognition. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixed, the kind that followed a person into every room. He climbed the short staircase to the suite and let himself in on the softest breath possible. The man did not look up immediately. From this close, Leo noticed details the newspapers never would have cared about. The faint crease between his brows, the loosened tie, the way the ice in his glass had melted untouched. "Your reserve, sir," Leo said, setting down the bottle. Only then did the man lift his gaze. It was an unexpectedly unsettling gaze, not because it was sharp, but because it was attentive. Most wealthy men saw service workers the way they saw furniture. Useful, replaceable, not especially individual. This man looked as if he had been underwater and had only now broken the surface. He studied Leo with a focus that made him feel visible in all the wrong ways. "What's your name?" Leo almost lied on instinct. Instead, he said, "Leo." The man repeated it softly, as if testing whether it belonged in his mouth. "Leo." There was no flirtation in the sound at first, just curiosity, exhaustion, something worn thin. "I'll leave you to your evening," Leo said. "Stay. It was not an order exactly. It was worse. It was a request spoken by someone unused to needing things. Leo should have ignored it. He knew that while his body remained still. He knew it while Jean laughed downstairs and a singer with a honey-thick voice drifted through the club. He knew it while the stranger, Kian Ashford, if rumor was right, leaned back and looked at him as though he had found an interruption he didn't want interrupted. "I'm working," Leo said. "So am I," Kian answered, glancing at the glass in his hand like it had personally offended him. "I'm just failing more elegantly." That almost pulled a smile from Leo, and he resented it. Men like Kian were dangerous precisely because they learned quickly where your defenses were weakest. A joke, a gentler tone than expected, a look that suggested he understood loneliness. Leo had been alive too long in too little comfort to trust any of those things. Down below, laughter burst against the low music. Jean appeared briefly at the door, all gold cufflinks and amused eyes, and made some teasing remark about not boring the guest. Leo barely heard it. Kian didn't laugh. He only watched Leo, waiting. "What did you expect?" Leo asked before he could stop himself. "Someone called her?" Kian's mouth tilted at one corner. "Weren't you?" Leo folded his arms lightly, more to hold himself together than out of defiance. "Maybe, but you don't look cold. You look lonely." The words slipped into the air and stayed there. For one dangerous second, Kian's expression emptied. Not blankness, impact. Like Leo had struck a bell hidden somewhere deep in him, and both of them were listening to the sound. "Don't say things you'll regret when I'm sober," Kian said quietly. Leo should have left then. He knew that too. He knew it the way he knew overdue notices by envelope color, and Maya's pain by the way she held her jaw too still. But the room had narrowed around that one exchange. The city glittered outside the tinted glass. Keen loosened the knot of his tie another inch. Leo had the irrational feeling that if he walked out, something unfinished would follow him all night. He stayed longer than he meant to. Long enough for the bottle to lower, for conversation to become easier than caution. Long enough to discover that Keen did not talk like the men who usually came into money, young and handsome, and convinced they were permanent. He was observant in odd little ways. He noticed that Leo favored his left foot after midnight. He noticed the cracked skin around Leo's knuckles. He noticed every time Leo almost spoke and then swallowed it. Leo noticed things too. Keen flinched, nearly imperceptibly, whenever his phone lit up with his father's name. He rubbed his thumb over the rim of the glass when he was angry. He had the disciplined posture of someone who had spent his whole life being watched and measured. His loneliness was not theatrical. It sat in him like an old injury he had learned to conceal under tailored cloth. When the singer changed to a slower song and the room softened further, the space between them lost its edges. Leo never later found the exact moment where caution tipped into wanting. One instant he was aware of the expensive cologne at Keen's throat, cedar and smoke under the cleaner scent of linen. The next he was aware of heat, of hands that touched as if asking permission even in their urgency, of the absurd tenderness of a man who looked built for command, but kissed like reverence was the only language he trusted. Neither of them was reckless by nature. That was what made the recklessness feel unreal. Leo knew better than to step into a world that would never keep him. Keen knew better than to seek comfort in a stranger whose life he did not understand. Yet loneliness could be a kind of weather too. And that night, it closed around them both. Leo let himself forget the rent due in 5 days, the unpaid consultation fee on Maya's kitchen table, the second shift waiting at dawn. Keen let himself forget the board meeting, the family expectations, the 1,000 hungry eyes attached to his last name. For a few brief hours, there was only warmth, breath, silence that did not need filling, and the impossible softness that arrived after desire, when two men lay still enough to hear each other think. Before dawn, reality returned in pieces. The first train rattled somewhere beyond the club district. Leo sat on the edge of the bed in the private room upstairs and buttoned his shirt with fingers that were steadier than he felt. Keen was half awake behind him, one arm flung across the sheets, hair disordered in a way that made him look startlingly young. For a dangerous moment, Leo wanted to stay until morning found them fully. He wanted coffee. He wanted conversation that had to survive daylight. He wanted something he had no right to want. Then Maya's face rose in his mind, the pale one she wore when the pain was bad and she was pretending it wasn't. He left before Keen opened his eyes. On the train home, the city looked washed out and unforgiving. Leo pressed his forehead to the window and told himself exactly what he needed to hear. Men like Keen Ashford did not wake up and remember the names of people they met in velvet rooms. They remembered mergers, headlines, obligations. Leo had rent. He had a sister whose next appointment could not be missed. He had no space in his life for fantasies dressed in cashmere. Maya was at the kitchen table when he got home, wrapped in one of his old hoodies, pretending to study while the electric kettle clicked uselessly behind her. Their apartment smelled faintly of damp walls and generic detergent. Morning light exposed every chipped corner. She took one look at him and made a face. "You look terrible," she said. He dropped a kiss on the top of her head as he passed. "And good morning to you too." She watched him with eyes too perceptive for 17. "Did you sleep?" "Eventually." "That means no." Leo found bread that was 1 day from staling and toasted it while calculating the remaining money in his account. The number in his head was so small it felt insulting. Maya's procedure was not a luxury, not something elective or cosmetic. Without surgery, her condition would worsen quickly. The doctors had stopped softening the truth weeks ago. Leo had taken extra shifts until the calendar blurred. The gap between what he earned and what she needed remained monstrous. He worked the cafe until noon, the courier route until evening, and the club again after dark. The days stacked. Sleep became something thin and unreliable. The memory of Kian should have faded under sheer exhaustion, but it didn't. It surfaced at inconvenient moments, when someone said the word lonely, when cedar cologne drifted past on a customer, when he woke briefly in the middle of the night with the sensation that something had been left behind in a room lit gold. 6 weeks later, standing in a pharmacy restroom with a cheap test clutched in his shaking hand, Leo felt the world tilt. He stared at the lines until they blurred. Then he counted backward. Not enough sleep, no appetite. The nausea he had dismissed as stress. The date. God, the date. He slid down the tiled wall and pressed his fist against his mouth hard enough to hurt. There was no dramatic denial in him, no cinematic disbelief.
There was only the brutal arithmetic of reality rearranging itself. Maya needed surgery in less than a month. Leo was already drowning in work. And now, inside him, there was a new fragile fact that wouldn't pause to accommodate any of it. He laughed once, breathlessly, because crying felt too obvious and too dangerous in a public bathroom. "Not now," he whispered to the blank metal stall door. "Please." But bodies didn't negotiate with timing.
By the time he got home that night, he had made 3 decisions. Maya would not know until he had to tell her. Keen would not know at all, not until Leo could stand on his own feet and make the truth sound like information instead of need. And whatever happened, this child would not feel unwanted, even for a second. Not even in his darkest thoughts. Fear was not the same as rejection. He put both hands over his abdomen through the thin fabric of his shirt and stood still until his breathing settled. "I'll protect you," he murmured. "It'll just be us, if it has to be." The club became impossible after that. The noise was too much, the late hours too sharp against his nausea, the flirtation from certain guests suddenly unbearable in a way it had never quite been before. Jin noticed his pallor, the way he braced himself against the bar when he thought no one was looking. Leo said it was fatigue. Jin looked unconvinced, but the club had no room for fragility. 3 nights later, Leo quit with a polite lie about scheduling conflicts and did not look back. The loss of income punched a hole through everything. He replaced it with another morning shift and sold 2 pieces of jewelry that had belonged to his mother. The amount they brought in was humiliating. He stopped taking taxis entirely. He skipped meals. He perfected the art of smiling at Maya while calculating which bill could be delayed without immediate disaster. Some nights he lay awake, listening to her cough through the wall, and wondered whether love alone could keep a family alive. The answer every morning was no. Love needed rent money. Love needed medication. Love needed $40,000 Leo did not have. He did not see Keen again until a wet afternoon in early spring, when the city streets were glazed with recent rain and Leo was coming off a courier shift with his backpack sticking damply to his shoulders. He had just stepped into the side entrance of the cafe for his next job when a familiar voice said his name like it had been dragged across months. Leo. His body reacted before his thoughts did. He turned. Keen Ashford stood half a step from the curb under a black umbrella held by someone else. The man beside him, assistant, bodyguard, some polished extension of wealth, faded from Leo's awareness instantly. Keen himself looked different than he had in the club. Cleaner somehow, in the hard daylight. More contained. His suit was charcoal, his hair neat, his face composed, but the restraint could not hide the intensity in his gaze. He looked like a man who had been holding one question for too long. "You disappeared," Keen said. Leo tightened his fingers around the strap of his bag. "People change jobs. I looked for you." That should not have mattered. It mattered so much that Leo had to shift his weight to stay steady. "Why?" Keen's eyes held his. "I don't know," he said after a beat. "I just did." It was not the answer of a practiced seducer. It was too blunt, too unfinished. Leo hated how much that honesty moved him. Rain hissed softly along the gutter. Behind him, someone in the kitchen shouted for more oat milk. The ordinary noise of the world kept going while Leo stood between 2 lives and felt both pulling. "I should go," he said. "I'm working." "Coffee after your shift." "That's not a question." "It can be." Keen's mouth softened very slightly. "Will you have coffee with me after your shift?" Leo almost said no. The sensible answer was no. He was tired, poor, pregnant, late for work, and already too entangled emotionally for a man he had spent a single night with. But Keen had shown up in the rain and admitted he had looked. It was such a small thing, and to Leo it felt enormous. "One coffee," he said. The cafe after close smelled of steamed milk and sugar crust. Leo wiped down the last counter while Keen waited in a corner booth that looked absurdly humble beneath him. He had removed his coat. He was answering emails with brutal efficiency, each movement controlled, but his attention kept lifting toward Leo, then away, then back again. Leo noticed because he was noticing everything. When he finally sat opposite him with a paper cup warming his hands, the silence between them held a different shape than it had at the club. Less charged with immediate desire, more dangerous because of what it implied. Keen had not forgotten. Leo had not managed to. "You look exhausted," Keen said. "You look observant. You're pale. So are most people under this lighting." Keen almost smiled. "You're still trying to keep me at a distance. We live in different worlds." "I know." The simple acceptance startled him more than denial would have. Keen did not ask where Leo lived or whether he was seeing anyone or why he had vanished. Instead, he asked what shifts he worked now. He asked how much coffee he drank in a week. He asked why he carried his shoulder like it pained him. Leo answered less than half of it and still somehow found himself saying more than he intended. Not about the pregnancy, not yet, but about Maya, about the hospital, about what it meant to be tired in a way that was not glamorous and never photographed well. "Tell me about her," Keen said quietly. And Leo did. He spoke of Maya's brilliance, the way she corrected his grammar when she was feeling well enough to be insufferable. He spoke of her sarcasm, the sketchbooks she hid under her mattress, the fury in her when illness tried to reduce her to numbers. He did not mention fear directly. He did not have to. Keen heard it anyway. Leo could tell by the stillness that came over him, the deepening line between his brows, the way he stopped checking his phone entirely. When Leo rose to leave, the city outside had gone dark again. "Dinner on Friday," Keen said, standing to. "That sounds very confident. I prefer optimistic." Leo looked at him for a long moment. "One dinner." Keen's expression changed in a way no newspaper would ever capture. Not triumph. Relief. The kind that reached the eyes first and made a person look briefly unguarded. Leo felt it like a hand on his ribs. "All right," Keen said. "One dinner." Leo intended to tell him the truth that night. He promised himself that while changing into his least worn shirt and smoothing his hair in the mirror over the sink. He promised it while Maya, suspiciously cheerful on a low-pain day, told him not to come home before midnight, and then denied she had said anything romantic. He promised it on the train to the River District, where Keen had somehow chosen a restaurant quiet enough to feel private without feeling hidden. The restaurant overlooked black water ribbed with city lights. Candles glowed low in heavy glass. The food arrived in portions so precise Leo almost laughed. But it was good. Better than good, actually. Subtle in a way that made him slow down to taste. Keen, to Leo's surprise, noticed the tiny details that made the evening easier. He ordered without grandstanding. He redirected the server when they spoke over Leo. He slid the breadbasket closer when Leo hadn't realized he was hungry enough to reach for it twice. No one had ever taken care of him so deliberately without making him feel small. It frightened him. They walked afterward because Leo said he needed air, and the river path was lined with lamps throwing soft gold over wet stone. Keen kept his hands in his coat pockets at first, as though restraining himself from reaching too soon. The silence between them was companionable now, not empty. Breathing. "Do you ever just walk?" Leo asked. "Without your phone? Without someone needing something from you?" "No." "Is this the first time?" "In a long time." Keen glanced at the dark water. "It's very nice." Leo smiled before he could stop himself. The smile disappeared when Keen's phone rang. He looked once at the screen, and all the warmth left his face. "What happened?" he said into the call, already turning. Then to Leo, "I'm sorry. I have to go." The pit in Leo's stomach was immediate and childish and embarrassing. He hated it. "Of course. It's not—" Keen stopped, like he did not have language for how not to wound a person by leaving them on a riverside after making them feel chosen. "It's urgent." Leo nodded because dignity required movement. "Go." Keen did, but not before touching Leo's wrist very lightly, a brief pressure that said more than apology and less than promise. Leo felt it long after the car took him away. By the time he reached the hospital that night, Maya was stable again. The medication reaction had frightened her doctors, but passed quickly enough. Fear left residue anyway. Leo sat beside her bed until dawn, exhaustion making everything unreal. At some point, he realized Keen was in the chair beside him. "You didn't have to stay," Leo whispered. Keen looked as tired as he felt. "You don't have to say that every time I do something because I want to." Leo had no answer to that. He let the silence settle. Under the antiseptic brightness of the hospital, Keen seemed almost more himself, less ornamental than in expensive restaurants, less armored than in the club. He rolled his sleeves and went downstairs for terrible coffee without complaint. He spoke softly to Maya when she woke, and Maya, contrary to Leo's dire predictions, did not instantly interrogate him to death. She simply blinked at him through medication-heavy lashes and said, "You're very tall for a friend," before falling asleep again. A day later, the hospital called with news Leo at first thought he had misheard. Maya's surgery had been funded in full through an anonymous donation. The procedure could be scheduled that week. The amount covered not only the surgeon, but the aftercare, the medications, the things Leo had not dared price out because they had felt too impossible. He stood in the corridor and cried before he could stop himself. When he found Keen outside by the vending machines that afternoon, sunlight flattening his expression through the glass, he already knew. "You did this," Leo said. Keen did not insult him by pretending otherwise. "She deserved to be safe. You had no right." "I know." The honesty hit harder than any defense could have. Leo pressed his palms against his face and laughed wetly, because fury and gratitude had collided so hard they were briefly the same thing. "I would have said no." "Yes," Keen's voice softened. "That's why I didn't ask." Leo lowered his hands. Keen was watching him with that same unbearable attentiveness from the club, only now it held none of the intoxicating mystery and all of the deliberate care. Leo realized, with the sharp clarity of fear, that he was in real danger now, not of being used, but of being loved in a way he had not planned for and did not know how to survive. "Maya is not a charity case," he said. "I know." I'm not either. I know that too. The answer disarmed him completely because it contained no pity at all, only certainty. Surgery week passed in a blur of hospital corridors, consent forms, and the metallic smell of fear. Maya tried to joke her way through the pre-op prep until the moment they rolled her bed toward the theater doors. Then her hand found Leo's and gripped so hard, his bones ached. "You better be here when I wake up," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Keen stood a step behind him, not intruding, not offering comfort to display it, simply present. Leo leaned into that presence without meaning to. By the 6th hour of surgery, his shoulder was touching Keen's. By the 9th, Keen's hand had settled over Leo's, where it twisted the edge of his own sleeve to threads. Neither of them mentioned it. When the surgeon finally emerged and said the procedure had gone well, Leo nearly folded in half with relief. Keen caught him before he hit the wall. Just a steadying grip at his elbow, but Leo felt it everywhere. After Maya's surgery came recovery, and after recovery came the slow, disorienting realization that the future had not ended after all. Leo did not know what to do with possibility. He had spent so long managing catastrophe that hope felt impractical, almost reckless. Keen, however, moved through hope like a man who knew it also required logistics. He found a better apartment. Not a palace, despite Maya's outraged delight. 2 bedrooms, clean windows, reliable heating. A kitchen big enough for 3 people to stand in without apologizing. No strings, he said. No conditions. Just somewhere safe. Leo said no twice before saying yes. The yes scared him almost as much as the pregnancy had. They moved on a bright, windy morning. The new place smelled of fresh paint and cardboard. Maya claimed the larger room immediately, with the lawless confidence of someone recently spared by the universe and therefore feeling entitled to test it. Keen arrived in rolled sleeves, carrying boxes that should not, by all social rules, ever have touched his hands. He knelt on a bare floor to assemble a crib Leo had bought second-hand and sanded smooth himself. He washed pans badly. He folded towels with absurd precision. He learned where Leo kept the tea. Domesticity did not arrive as a grand revelation. It arrived in teaspoons, in the remembered order of Leo's coffee, in a hand at the small of his back when nausea struck unexpectedly, in Keen showing up after meetings with groceries he pretended were extra, in Maya loudly accusing both of them of being impossible while secretly relaxing for the first time in months. Telling Keen about the baby had been Leo's private terror. He waited too long, then waited longer, then finally blurted it out in the half-unpacked kitchen while rain tapped against the new window and a cardboard box labeled dishes leaned dangerously near the sink. Keen went very still. For one obliterating second, Leo thought he had made the worst mistake of his life. Then Keen sat down hard on an unopened box and laughed once under his breath. Not from mockery, but sheer stunned wonder. He put both hands over his face and stayed like that for several breaths. When he lowered them, his eyes were bright. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since about 6 weeks." "And you carried this alone?" Leo looked at the floor. "I carry most things alone." Something changed in Keen's expression then. Not anger, not exactly, but a kind of grief sharpened into intention.
He stood, crossed the small space between them, and touched Leo's face with both hands, as if confirming he was real. "Not anymore," he said. That was the moment, Leo thought later, when love stopped being a possibility and became an environment. It did not make everything easier. Keen's family name came with attention like floodwater. There were whispers before there were headlines, suspicious glances before there were cameras. Leo understood quickly that people could look at his belly and see not a child, but a narrative that suited them. Opportunist, gold digger, anonymous omega from nowhere. The ugliness of it arrived faster than he expected, and still not faster than Keen, stepping between him and the worst of it. When the story finally broke in the press, it detonated exactly where Leo feared. Every major outlet, every gossip page, every financial blog hungry for scandal with money attached. Someone from the Ashford side had leaked it. The article used words like heir and complication and controversial relationship. It flattened Leo into a category and Keen into a cautionary spectacle. Keen came to the apartment before the first press conference, rain still clinging to his coat.
His jaw set with a calm that only barely concealed fury. "Have you seen it?" he asked. Leo held up his phone. "Hard to miss." Keen crossed the room in 2 steps and stopped close enough that Leo could feel the heat coming off him. "Listen to me. I am going to deal with this. You are not to read any more of it." "That's not realistic." "No, it's not." He closed his eyes briefly, mastering himself. "Then at least let me be the first thing you hear, not them." Leo swallowed around the tightness in his throat. "All right." Keen remembered, absurdly, the way Leo took his coffee. Oat milk, no sugar, extra hot. He had brought one in his hand, despite the chaos waiting for him downtown. That tenderness undid Leo more than the public defense that followed, though the defense mattered. Standing at a podium ringed with microphones, Keen looked directly into cameras and said, with terrifying composure, that yes, he was expecting a child with someone he cared about deeply. And no, he would not allow the press to reduce that person to a headline. He spoke of strength, of privacy, of respect. He did not hedge. He did not apologize. Watching from the sofa, Leo cried against his own irritation at crying. Maya, recovering on a nest of pillows and blankets, threw him a tissue box without comment. "So," she said after a moment, "you love him." Leo laughed through tears. "I think I really do. Obviously." The cost of that public choice arrived before evening. Keen's father summoned him. Voices were raised in a house Leo had never entered and could picture anyway. Too much stone, too much inherited silence, too many portraits of men who believed legacy mattered more than tenderness. When Keen came back, he looked composed until the front door shut behind him. Then the composure slipped. "He disinherited me," he said. Leo went cold. "Keen." He shook his head once. "Do not say this is because of you. It is because I refused to become someone smaller to please him." Leo had never known what to do with men in pain, not men who were taught never to show it. He did the only thing that felt true. He took Keen's face in his hands, the way Keen had once done to him, and kissed him gently. Not to distract, but to answer. Keen leaned into it as if he had been standing against wind all day. Without the Ashford name, doors closed. Investors who smiled at Keen's surname reconsidered when confronted with only his competence. Leo watched him fight through it with a steadiness that deepened love into respect. There was no dramatic collapse, no decadent spiral. Keane rose earlier, read more, called people back, walked into rooms where men twice his age tested him, and came out having moved the terms in his favor. At night, he returned to the apartment, stripped down to exhaustion, loosened tie and tired eyes, and all that fierce intelligence still humming under the skin. Leo learned how to sit with him in silence until he was ready to speak. Keane learned how to let someone witness the moments that were not polished for public use. One evening, Leo found him at the kitchen table, with spreadsheets open beside a tiny pair of baby socks Maya had bought as a joke and then cried over in secret. Keane was staring at the socks like they were a sacred text. "They're very small," he said. Leo leaned against the doorframe, smiling. "That's because babies are small." Keane looked up. "Will they actually be this small?" "At first, yes." "Remarkable." Leo laughed so hard he had to sit down. By then, his body had changed enough that strangers noticed before friends could pretend not to. Pregnancy made him more visible in ways he still struggled with. His omega scent shifted subtly, warmer and sweeter at the edges, enough that certain alphas on the street turned their heads before good manners corrected them. Keane noticed too, though never with entitlement. He simply grew more attentive in crowded places, his body positioning itself between Leo and everyone else with such unconscious consistency that Maya began rating his protective alpha instincts aloud on a 10-point scale. Keane endured this with the grave patience of a man already outnumbered in his own home. The first Ashford Leo met willingly was not Keane's father, but his mother. Elena Ashford arrived carrying flowers and the kind of poise that looked effortless until you noticed the steel underneath. She was elegant in cream wool and low heels, her perfume soft and expensive, but her eyes were kind in a manner that immediately disarmed Leo. She took in the apartment, the stacked baby books, the folded blankets on the chair, the evidence of a life being built without grandeur and very much on purpose. "I brought flowers," she said. "May I come in and meet my grandchild properly?" Leo, who had prepared himself for judgment and found courtesy instead, nearly laughed from relief. "Yes," he said, "of course." She did not perform affection, she practiced it. She asked before touching Leo's arm. She praised Maya's sketches with genuine interest. She told Keane to stop hovering over the kettle and then smiled when he ignored her. When she rested a hand lightly over Leo's stomach after being invited, her face transformed in a way that made Leo understand where Keane's hidden softness had first been learned. "You've made him happy," she said quietly later when Maya had gone to answer a call and Keane was in the other room arguing with an instruction manual. "I hadn't seen that in him before." Leo did not know what to say to such a gift. He settled for honesty. "He's made things possible for us." Elena's gaze sharpened with something like sorrow. "That is not all he's done." No, it wasn't. Love, Leo discovered, was often easiest to trust in its smallest forms. Keane buying the exact crackers that helped when nausea hit. Kian timing the drive to the hospital at 3 in the morning for no reason, which of course meant for every reason. Kian color-coding the labor bag in a way Leo mocked for days before privately feeling soothed by it. Kian reading medical articles at midnight and then pretending not to have when Leo caught him. Kian kneeling to tie Leo's shoelace because bending over had become a negotiation. Kian kissing the center of Leo's back when Braxton Hicks contractions made him stop mid-sentence and hold still. There were lighter moments too, because otherwise none of it would have been survivable. Maya announcing she had already moved into the nursery mentally and therefore had naming rights. Leo discovering that Kian, for all his efficiency, could not cook rice without consulting a search engine. The ongoing war over whether the dark film on Leo's favorite pan was seasoning or neglect. Kian, deeply offended at being corrected, Googling it during dinner just to maintain argumentative standards. Laughter in the kitchen while soup simmered and the apartment steamed up with ordinary warmth. The proposal happened badly, which was to say honestly. They had spent an hour trying to agree on names. Maya had vetoed half the list on aesthetic grounds and then left to meet friends, announcing that the child deserved two fathers capable of independent thought. The apartment was quiet. Evening light striped the floor. Kian had been carrying something odd in him all week, some restless precision that Leo recognized as nerves. "What about Saul?" Leo asked, more to fill the silence than because he expected immediate agreement. Kian looked up too fast. "Saul Ashford Santos." Leo blinked. "You already tried it aloud." "I might have." A laugh escaped Leo. "You've been planning." "I had a speech," Kian admitted. "Where is it?" "It sounded like a contract." "That does sound like you." Kian stood. For a man who could dismantle hostile negotiations without blinking, he looked unexpectedly uncertain. The uncertainty made him younger and dearer, and somehow even more formidable, because Leo understood how much courage it took for a controlled man to abandon control. "Leo," he said and stopped. Leo waited. "Will you marry me?" There was no kneeling, no ring presented with ceremony, no polished phrasing. Just a man standing in a kitchen full of ordinary things, asking the largest question of his life, as if truth were more important than style. "That wasn't even a question," Leo said softly, smiling through the sudden sting in his eyes. "You said it like a statement." "I was confident in the outcome." "Insufferable." "Yes," Keen said. "And?" Leo crossed the room and touched his face. "Yes." The word changed the light in the room. Later, lying in bed with Keen's hand spread over the curve of his stomach, Leo admitted the fear that had lived under his ribs for months. "What if I'm not good enough at the actual being a parent part?" Keen was quiet a long time before answering. "You parented Maya since you were 19. "That's not the same." "No," Keen said, "it isn't. This time you won't be alone." There it was again. That promise without grand display, given in the tone of a man discussing whether he fully intended to withstand. Leo believed him, not because love made him foolish, but because Keen had taught belief through repetition. Action, presence, consistency. The slow accumulation of kept promises. When Keen's father finally came to the apartment, he arrived stripped of most of his old authority. Not because wealth had vanished from him, but because regret had made him human-sized. Leo opened the door, expecting tension sharp enough to cut skin. Instead, he found an older man standing oddly still, gaze fixed first on Leo's face, and then, with an expression he could not quite hide, on the framed sonogram picture beside the entryway. "I came to see my grandchild," the man said. Kian appeared instantly at Leo's shoulder, every line of his body alert. "Eventually." The answer could have turned ugly. Leo felt that possibility flash and pass. Then he saw something in the older man's face, weariness perhaps, or the dawning realization that power had failed to secure the thing he actually wanted. Leo thought of all the fathers who did not know how to love without controlling. He thought of Maya in the hospital and how fear could make people cruel. He stepped back. "You may come in," he said. The visit was brief, awkward, honest in patches. Keen's father looked around the apartment as though seeing for the first time the difference between prestige and home. He watched Keen move through the kitchen without being asked. He watched Leo sit down when his back ached, and Keen bring him tea before the request finished forming. He watched the life his son had chosen and could not quite deny its substance. "He's happy," the older man said at last, almost to himself. "I hadn't seen that before." No one answered immediately. The silence itself became an answer. When he turned back to Leo, whatever pride he had brought with him had thinned. "I am sorry," he said. "Genuinely." Leo considered him. The apology did not erase anything. It did not restore lost months or headlines or wounds. But it was real, and real things mattered. "It led here," Leo said, one hand over the child moving lazily beneath his skin. "So I'm not sure how sorry I am in the end." To his credit, the older man gave a brief, surprised nod. "Fair enough." Winter tilted toward spring. Keen won back ground at work the brutal, unglamorous way, by proving, repeatedly, that his surname had never been the true asset in the room. Leo watched one presentation online because Maya insisted, and afterward he sat at the kitchen table smiling at nothing while a kettle boiled dry. Investors who had doubted him reconsidered when numbers, not lineage, answered their skepticism. Eventually, one deal landed so large, the industry press could not avoid stating the obvious. Keen Ashford, disinherited or not, remained Keen Ashford, because talent had never belonged to his father. Maya printed the article and stuck it to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a cat. "Subtle," Leo said. "I'm a woman of nuance," she replied. By the last weeks of pregnancy, Leo carried not only weight, but a strange, shimmering anticipation that made every hour vivid. He became aware of details as if the world were sharpening itself for arrival. The laundry detergent on baby clothes dried in the window light, the creak in the hallway floorboards at midnight, the warmth of Keen's palm on his lower back during the small, false contractions that made them both sit up too fast. Keen had turned preparedness into an art form. The hospital bag was color-coded, the route was timed, the paperwork was printed twice. Maya claimed this was evidence of panic. Leo privately thought it was evidence of love translated into logistics, which was Keen's native language. The night labor began, the city was hushed under a thin rain. Leo woke to pressure low in his belly and the distinct knowledge that something had shifted from abstract future into immediate fact. He sat on the edge of the bed, breathing through it, while the room stayed dark, except for the street lamp glow slicing the curtains. Keen woke on the first change in Leo's breathing. "What is it?" Leo almost said nothing. Then another contraction gripped, tighter, and he caught the edge of the mattress. "I think," he managed, "it's time." Keen did not panic. It was one of the reasons Leo loved him so devastatingly. He became calm with the ferocious clarity of a man stepping into a role he had rehearsed in every private corner of his mind. Light on, bag in hand, coat found, phone, wallet, documents. Maya shaken gently awake and then fully alert in under 5 seconds. The car already downstairs, because of course Keen had arranged that possibility hours ago. "The hospital is 12 minutes away at this hour," he said while helping Leo into his shoes. "You timed it." "At 3 in the morning specifically." Leo might have laughed if another contraction had not climbed through him like fire wrapped in pressure. Instead, he grabbed Keen's forearm and breathed. Keen lowered his forehead briefly to Leo's. "I'm here," he murmured. "Right here." Rain streaked the windows during the drive. Street lights slid gold across Keen's hands on the wheel. Maya sat in the back and tried not to look frightened, which only made her look more so. Leo focused on breathing, on the familiar cedar-clean scent of Keen beside him, on the way the city emptied itself before dawn as though making room. Labor shattered any illusions Leo had retained about grace. It was work in the most elemental sense, blood-hot, relentless, private in a way no one could ever fully explain after the fact. Hours lost their shape. Pain came and went and came again larger, until time itself narrowed to the space between one wave and the next. Through all of it, Keen remained. A cup of ice chips held to Leo's lips. A hand never withdrawn. Words repeated until they became a rope. "You've got this. I'm here. Breathe with me. Don't let go." At one point, Leo, exhausted beyond pride, whispered, "Don't stop talking." Keen leaned in until his voice was the clearest thing in the room. He told Leo about the first night at the club, about how Leo had looked under amber light with stubbornness in every line of him, about the riverside walk, about the first time he saw Maya laugh at one of his terrible jokes and understood family wasn't always inherited. He spoke of ordinary futures, tea gone cold on counters, school pickups, weddings they hadn't yet planned properly, dancing badly in kitchens. He spoke until Leo believed there would be an after. When the final push split him open with effort and terror and impossible relief, the first cry was not loud, just sharp enough to remake the room. "He's here," someone said. Leo did not immediately understand the sentence. Then Keen was laughing and crying at once, which Leo had never seen before, and a tiny, furious weight was being placed against his chest. The world contracted to warmth, damp skin, trembling hands. "Hey," Leo whispered. The baby's face was red and indignant and astonishing. His mouth opened in outrage. One hand flexed against Leo's skin with heartbreaking minuteness. Leo felt love hit him not as a bloom but as a plunge, so complete it took his breath on the way down. Beside him, Keen made a broken sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You're crying," Leo murmured weakly. "So are you." "Fair." Keen touched their son with the reverence of someone handling his own heart outside his body. "Hello, Saul," he whispered. "I'm your father, and I already love you more than I understand." The nurse announced the weight, the measurements, the practical data of new life. Leo heard almost none of it. He watched Keen watch Saul and understood something bright and ancient move through the room. Not just the making of a family, but the recognition of one. Later, when Elena arrived, and then after careful permission, Keen's father too, the room filled with all the complicated tenderness of people standing near something larger than themselves. Maya cried the second she saw Saul and denied it so aggressively that everyone laughed. Keen's father stood at the foot of the bed, older than Leo had ever seen him, and said simply, "Well done, son." Keen, eyes still fixed on Leo and the baby against his chest, answered without looking away. It was Leo. Yes, Leo thought, exhausted and incandescent. It was. But it was also Keen. It was both of them in the only way that mattered now.
Homecoming transformed the apartment.
There was soup on the stove because Elena had quietly made it while no one was looking. There were flowers somehow. There were folded blankets and diapers, and Maya hovering with the intensity of a newly promoted bodyguard. Saul cried at odd hours and slept at odder ones. Keen discovered he could handle high-stakes negotiations on 4 hours of broken sleep, but not the emotional consequence of seeing Leo too tired to finish his tea. Leo discovered that the weight of a sleeping baby on his chest could silence every old panic for exactly 23 minutes at a time. In the quieter hours, when Keen had fallen asleep over a report, or Maya was pretending not to be worried from behind a sketchbook, Leo sometimes stood alone in the nursery doorway and let himself feel the strangeness of survival. The room was still incomplete then, one curtain hemmed, one shelf unmounted, the paint smelling faintly new, but even unfinished it held more tenderness than any place Leo had ever expected to claim. He would run his fingertips over the crib rail, over folded cotton sleepers and absurdly tiny socks, and wonder how a life built out of fear had opened far enough to let hope in. It did not feel like rescue. Rescue implied passivity. This felt earned, though not alone. Built by his hands and Maya's stubbornness and Keen's refusal to let love remain abstract. Some nights he woke before dawn and found Keen already in the nursery chair, Saul against his shoulder, both of them outlined by the dim nightlight. Keen would look up with that private smile Leo had come to treasure, the one that belonged to no one else, and whisper, "He likes the heartbeat." Leo would take the baby and settle beside him, their knees touching in the half-dark. The room would smell of milk and clean cotton and the faint medicinal sweetness of baby lotion. Outside, the city would continue with all its indifferent noise. Inside, there would be this. 2 men who had found each other in the wrong room at the wrong time and made from that accident a life so deliberate it felt like defiance. Their wedding, when it came, was small on purpose. No ballroom, no press. No spectacle built for anyone else's approval. Just a garden behind a converted old house at the edge of the city, sunlight moving through leaves, white chairs slightly uneven on the lawn. Maya threatening to sabotage anyone who cried too early. Saul wore a tiny suit that made him look offended by formality. Elena brought flowers again. Keen's father stood quietly to one side, careful now in a way power rarely learned to be. Jean came, to everyone's surprise except Leo's, wearing a suit loud enough to qualify as weather and kissing both of Leo's cheeks while pretending not to be emotional. Before the ceremony, Leo found Keen alone under a tree, straightening his cuffs for the 3rd time. "You nervous?" Leo asked. "I am about to bind my life permanently to the most stubborn man I have ever met," Keen replied. Obviously, Leo laughed. "You say that like you had no part in this." "I had many parts, most of them excellent." "Arrogant." "Accurate." Leo stepped closer and smoothed an invisible crease from Keen's lapel. The fabric was fine wool, dark and impeccably cut. Beneath it, Keen's heart was beating fast. "We're not very good at dancing," Leo said quietly. "No," Keen agreed. "We should probably practice before the reception." "Probably." Saul, from Maya's arms nearby, made a soft, indignant sound. Keen glanced over and smiled. Saul agrees. The ceremony itself passed in a shimmer Leo would later struggle to recount in order. He remembered the sunlight on Keen's face. He remembered saying vows that had been rewritten a dozen times because none of the language felt large enough. He remembered Keen's hand trembling once, just once, when he slid the ring on. He remembered Saul laughing at exactly the wrong solemn moment and everyone laughing with him. He remembered the astonishing calm that settled in him when Keen said, in a voice low and certain enough to anchor ships, that he was happy, more than he had known was possible. Afterward, there was food that tasted of garlic and butter and celebration, and music soft enough for conversation, and a dance floor no one was skilled enough to master. Leo held Saul for the first part, swaying more than dancing. Then Keen took the baby with absurd competence and said, "4 steps, you did it before." Leo rolled his eyes. That was not dancing. That was surviving labor. Same rhythm. They moved anyway, badly, laughing, Saul blinking between them like a solemn little judge. For one suspended moment, Leo saw them almost from outside. Keen in rolled sleeves because the jacket had come off quickly. Saul with Keen's eyes and Leo's stubborn mouth. Himself held steady in a way he had once believed impossible. The music drifted. The lights warmed as evening deepened. Somewhere at the edge of the lawn, Maya was crying again and blaming pollen. Months later, after the thank you cards and the sleepless spells and the endless small miracles of watching Saul become himself, Leo found the note Keen had written the night before the birth. It had been folded into the side pocket of the hospital bag with the color-coded tabs and over-prepared lists. The handwriting was precise, almost severe, until the final lines where it slanted with emotion. Before I had anything, before my father, before the boardrooms, before the life that taught me to measure worth in outcomes, I already loved you. I loved you before I met our son. I loved you before I understood what being loved by you would ask of me. If fear comes tomorrow, I will stay. If joy comes, I will stay. If the world narrows or widens, I will stay. Leo sat on the nursery floor and cried quietly enough not to wake the baby. That evening, when Keen came home smelling faintly of rain and city air and success worn lightly, Leo handed him the note without explanation. Keen read it, looked up, and went unexpectedly shy. "You found that?" "I did. It was private. You put it in the hospital bag." "I was sleep-deprived." Leo smiled and reached for him. Keen came willingly, kneeling on the rug despite the expensive trousers, resting his forehead against Leo's. Through the crib bars, Saul made a soft, sleepy noise, turned his face into the mattress, and settled again. "Are you happy?" Leo asked. Keen did not answer immediately. He looked around the small room at the books piled in the corner, the folded blankets, the moon-shaped nightlight, the life built, piece by difficult piece. Then he looked back at Leo. "More than I knew was possible," he said. Leo believed him. More importantly, he felt the truth of it in himself, too. Outside the apartment, the city remained what it had always been, impatient, glittering, indifferent to who suffered and who was saved. There were still bills, there were still headlines somewhere, there were still men in expensive offices pretending money could cure every emptiness worth naming. But inside this home, there was soup cooling on the stove. A pan on the counter Keen still insisted was not seasoned properly. A sleeping child with one fist curled near his cheek. and a love that had not arrived cleanly or conveniently, but had arrived all the same and stayed. It had started in a dim room above a club between two men who should have remained strangers by every ordinary rule. One had been carrying too much for too long. The other had been surrounded by everything except the thing he actually needed. They had mistaken each other at first for a brief solace, a single night against the dark. Instead, they became the place the other returned to. For Leo, that was still the miracle of it. Not that Keen had chosen him once, in urgency or loneliness, but that Keen kept choosing. In kitchens, in hospitals, in doorways after terrible days, in public when it cost him, in private when no one would have known. Love, Leo had learned, was not a fever dream or a headline or a rescue so grand it erased the person being rescued. It was repetition. It was being seen without being reduced. It was a hand held through the worst pain and still offered the morning after for smaller, less cinematic aches. One night, much later, Leo stood by the window with Saul asleep against his shoulder and watched rain bead on the glass. The apartment behind him glowed amber. Keen was in the kitchen making tea and muttering at the kettle because it never boiled fast enough for his liking. Maya, stronger now and bright with plans for a future she had almost been denied, was out with friends and would come home late and hungry and loud. The ordinary sounds of their life drifted around him. He felt Keen come up behind him before he spoke, the familiar warmth settling carefully along Leo's back so as not to wake the baby. "What are you thinking?" Keen asked. Leo looked down at Saul's sleeping face, then out at the city, then at the reflection of all three of them in the darkened glass. "That we're doing fine," he said. Keen's arms tightened very slightly, just enough to be felt. "We are." And in that moment, with the rain soft against the window and his son breathing slow and warm against his chest, and the man he loved standing steady at his back, Leo knew something that would have been impossible in the old apartment, impossible in the club, impossible in the pharmacy restroom where fear had once hollowed him out. He knew that happiness did not have to arrive as perfection to be real. Sometimes it arrived exhausted and late and carrying groceries. Sometimes it arrived after surgery, after scandal, after disinheritance and labor and doubt. Sometimes it arrived in a man who showed love through action until words finally caught up. Saul stared, opened his eyes for one drowsy second, and then settled again. Keen smiled at the sight. "He has your eyes," he said for perhaps the 100th time. "You always say that." "Because it's true." Leo turned enough to kiss him, careful and unhurried. Beyond them, the kettle clicked off. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked in the familiar way. Their home breathed around them, full of everything they had fought to keep. "Come on," Leo murmured. "Tea." Keen nodded. Together they turned from the window and walked back into the light.